today's topic that I'm going to present is evolutionary testing strategy. I'm a principal QA at ThoughtWorks. I recently released a book with O'Reilly called Full Stack Testing. Also play multiple other roles with respect to ThoughtWorks capabilities, tech advisory board. So quickly moving on to the topic, evolutionary testing strategy. I'm sure the name would trigger some thoughts about evolutionary architecture, first of all, right? Evolutionary architectures, I think it's a popular book that has come up, the second edition is also out right now. And what it really means is in the changing ecosystem of where there are business requirements that are completely changing volatilely, and the technical landscape that are constantly changing, the architecture, the software architecture should be able to survive those changes, and it should be able to have some guiding parameters that will aid the incremental change process. That's the crux of the book, Evolutionary Architecture, and that's the concept that has been widely spoken about in the book as well, right? And I hope we all also agree, and working in IT, we would have seen how much is this so true, right? Like every day there's a new technical tool that is getting released, and you would have heard the business suddenly coming back and tell you the priorities have changed, which means that any long-term visionary architecture cannot stand hold unless it is guided by incremental change, right? So the question is, when software architecture changes, we have accepted that it needs to evolve. We have seen that the business requirements is changing. The market is volatile. So the business literally wants to try different products and see which one works, that kind of an environment. What happens when the testing strategy hasn't evolved parallelly, right? The software architecture is changing, the business requirements is changing. And what happens when the testing strategy is just static? That's the crux of the message today, the evolutionary testing strategy. And this is what exactly happens, right? Keeping the testing strategy unpolished is like keeping one wheel in a tricycle constant, while the other two, the business requirements and the software architecture, keeps moving. So basically, you're just like trying to keep one thing static, the other things are keeping on moving, and you're just reactive about your testing process at many times. It's just like the last thing that's been looked upon, because there's like, okay, things have changed, now put a new architecture, now put a new team together to develop a new stuff. But the testing processes, the testing architecture is all left to the end. And that's what I call it as testing strategy in the first place. So the result is going to be most of the times harmful for the software team. Maybe to elaborate this impact, let's consider a few examples, right? Like some of the places where people have kept the testing strategy static, but the other two things are like constantly evolving. Let's take a few examples. Example one, the 5-year plan. Let's just say an enterprise is modernizing the legacy technology landscape, right? The enterprise is like a large organization which has multiple teams going across globe. That's the kind of landscape that I'm talking about. And 30 to 40 years of legacy code, and they're trying to modernize it because they've come to realize that's not serving them. Typically, there's very less documentation, there's no SMEs. And the first thing that they come to do is lay a 5-year plan, right? Like to procure a budget, because modernization of a code that has written 30 to 40 years needs a lot of budget. An enterprise way of working is to propose a business plan and secure a 5-year budget. And the 5-year delivery plan needs to be supported solidly by technical architecture, technical choices, and testing strategy. And what do you think will the testing strategy be looking like, right? Like for a 5-year plan, like something that is like so long fetched, what will it be really looking like? Of course, it's going to be such a high level. And if somebody is really thinking that the testing strategy put across by 5 years ago is going to survive its time without evolving it, it's just going to be a myth. It's just going to be like 100,000 feet above. And if there is no constant practice of evolving the testing strategy parallel to all the technical choices and the evolution of the feature, it's like absolutely no point in investing time in delivering this kind of a long-term gain. So that's one example. The other thing is another example of business priorities changes, right? Let's just say a team is building a website with two backend services. There's one, and as you can see on the left-hand side, there's a backend services and there's a centralized database. And given the timelines for go live, they carve their test architecture to include unit tests and the E2E web view tests. So this is the test architecture. There are unit tests and there are E2E tests. And halfway through the delivery, the business decides to make APIs as the product instead of website as a product. So far, the concentration was website. And then suddenly the business comes back, okay, check off the website. Now we need services, the APIs to be the product. And you have actually created E2E tests and unit tests for the test architecture. And the team is now looking at APIs as the product and to leave off the website. So the team should actually be in a place where they can pause, look back at how it affects the test strategy, how it affects the test architecture, to even react to the business priorities changes. Otherwise, they just like blank, they just have to run fast. And we'll see the consequences in the coming up slides as well. And then there are software architecture changes. The same team, let's just say they decide to change the architecture as well, right? They replace the centralized database that we saw, which the services were talking to. They replace it with an event stream because that needs to cater to some downstream services. And they just thought, okay, DB is not working fine. Let's just move to an event stream. And usually the mentality is like, okay, what happens to the development efforts? What is the scenarios that we have to actually cover from a feature point of view? But even if the team has created API tests after the business priorities changes, like in the last example, it won't be enough because there is a lot of asynchronous behavior that comes into the event system. So unless in other ways, the team sits and reflects holistically, okay, this is an architecture change. Now, how does it affect the testing process? It doesn't actually serve the team in any way, especially a large team, like a change from a DB to event stream. So usually there is this mentality to undermine the kind of impact that it has on the testing side of things. Sometimes the entire test architecture have to be changed. Sometimes the testability is hindered, and therefore you need to add more development efforts to create that testability, like adding some observability into the system, adding some mocks, whatever it may need to create the testability into that system. But unless otherwise, there is a moment or there is a practice, there is process to sit back and look at how can we evolve the testing strategy with the trigger to software architecture changes or business priority changes. These kind of things just goes under the rug. And remember that, I mean, we would have already seen this, right? Like once some architecture changes happens in like we would completely get immersed ourselves into making sure that the change is catering to functional requirements and we are able to catch all the functional defects. But suddenly there'll be the question, okay, what happened to performance, for example, a cross-functional requirement? Did the architecture change result in a performance impact? That will be the question posted to the testers once again as a result of all the changes that are happening, but it was not thought through ahead. So unless the team has paused at some point to reflect back saying this kind of a change result in these kind of testing parameters changes and therefore scope some effort to do performance testing at an API level, they will have to go back and say to the business that they won't be able to meet the testing timelines and therefore the release. So whatever changes that people have done for the benefit of business, right? Like to get more market share, more profit. If we don't actually include the testing point of view, it eventually affects the go live time and therefore the go live, the very intention of taking the product to the market, and that hampers everything, the cost, even though it just like comes at the very last stage. So let's just say that the business heard the team say, okay, the changes couldn't be tested, and therefore we can't go live in the stipulated time. They might come back to you and say that, okay, to meet the timeline, the business will add one more team. Okay, let's accelerate the development. Let's put in one more team, right? Like that's like the usual proposal for every problem. Add more people, get it done. That's the kind of things that we hear most often. So they decide to actually put or another team, spin up a new team. Let's get one more team up. Let's make each team develop one service independently, and let them take the features to completion in the stipulated time. That's like, let's march forward. What happens then, right? What happens if the team structure changes actually to the testing strategy? What happens there? So far, the QAs on the team would have covered all the edge cases because they knew the entire domain, they knew what changes happened to each of the services, how they spoke to each other. But suddenly they would be in two different teams, and each team would have their own prioritization. They won't have that, or they might have very partial knowledge about what is happening in the other team. And what happens is this leads to testing process changes, right? Like you suddenly will have to look at how do you do a system integration testing, or do you need contract tests? Like it has a ripple effect, which is like affecting the testing process. Testing process is also part of your test strategy, right? Testing process, test architecture, testing tools, all of these are part of the testing strategy. And that will have an eventual impact. But most often when these kind of triggers to changes are not really well thought through, and it is mostly at a very later point in time, people come back to realize, okay, this kind of a change impacted the testing process, and therefore now I've added um, more consequences to my entire go live process, and I haven't thought through about it. And one more example, right? Let's just say, like, how many tech industry changes are happening day to day? There are so many tech industry changes that are happening, and that has an impact on the testing strategy itself. Like whatever that the tools that we are using today on the project, and whatever technologies, whatever practices that we are using, there's like a constant change in the industry that is happening, and each of that has an impact on how the testing strategy for the team is actually going to be. Like for example, the APM 2.0 release, right? Like some of the features from APM 1 were deprecated. There were proper announcements to actually move to APM 2.0 for a very long time. Um, but if the suit is on APM 1.0 and the testing strategy hasn't been carved out to move to APM 2.0 or to move to some other tool, whatever it may be, you are in a position where you are using something legacy, you're building a legacy which is no longer supported. So carving that capacity out for moving from deprecated methods to a new release, that is all a certain set of activity which you do to evolve your test strategy. So all of these changes like have a significant impact, right? Like some people don't look at it as a significant impact, but what happens is when you have a older release of, so like I've seen clients who come to us with like Selenium RC, right? Like, which world were you in when the world has moved to web driven? What happened? Really, that will be like the kind of things that will be going on in our heads. And but it does happen. But what they don't realize is the accumulated, this is also a tech debt, right? Like whatever from the testing point of view is accumulated as is a tech debt. Eventually it will be like a big bang project where it will be like, okay, let us rewrite the entire test suite. Instead, it has to be constantly evolved, like incrementally evolved. Okay, there's a tech industry change coming up, the tools are getting changed, then it needs to be included in the upcoming testing strategy changes, and therefore I will allocate some capacity for that. That is a kind of continuous evolution process that will help the team to stay up to date. They don't actually develop a legacy product, but they are actually developing something in trend with the industry. And some new innovations happen that is really useful, right? Like some test containers that gives a lot of browsers. There are databases where that comes out of test containers, and it's like an ephemeral environment where you can spin up and down and throw away, which is really useful, helps solve a lot of problem statements in the testing world. Otherwise you'd be spending some manual efforts in creating that. All this testing management efforts, maintenance efforts could be curbed down. These are all improvements, but unless you have a process in place or a practice in place where you look back at your testing strategy, look back at all these kinds of triggers to testing strategy changes and evolve your testing strategy, this will be like a tech debt that you're accumulating over a period of time that only uh, comes to visibility at a very later stage. And it's just like a rush to go live, all these things are pushed aside. And also, like, when the industry changes, like legal regulations around data privacy, accessibility, all of those things affect the testing strategy, right? Like now you have to look at how you include your privacy angles, how you actually test for your accessibility angles, because these are legal requirements. These legal requirements also do a version upgrade, if you have noticed, and each of these things will have some tool upgrades. I mean, there are good open source contributors who also help in creating such new tools, but the mindset and the practice within the software development team to evolve the testing strategy is still lagging behind, and that creates the hazard of a laid back rush towards go live kind of a mindset. So that's the whole that's a crux of why evolutionary testing strategy. Those are like significant trigger points. Examples were significant trigger points to tell you how tech industry changes, business priorities changes. All those things that we looked at in the past examples influence the testing strategy and why we need to do a evolutionary testing strategy. So what do evolutionary testing strategy mean? An evolutionary testing strategy is one where the test architecture, the testing process, and the testing tools are constantly evolved with the changes to business requirement, software architecture, and the tech landscape changes, guided by the fitness functions. So fitness functions is once again a concept from the evolutionary architecture ways of working. It is nothing but saying that all the evolution should be within this boundaries, like just say like this should be the functionality, this should be the performance guidelines, this should be the requirement from on metrics point of view. So that is called as the fitness functions. And while we are evolving the testing strategy, the guideline is that kind of a fitness function from the evolutionary architecture world that also applies to evolutionary testing strategy. A few quick set of starter steps on how do we implement this kind of a method, right? Like there's a mindset change, there's a practice that needs to come into picture. How do we implement this in the team? Um, a starting point could be something like architecture decision records, which is called as ADRs, and business decision records, BDRs, is a very good starting place. Whenever there is an architecture decision record or a business decision record, the test strategy should be evolved. We should be able to use this as trigger points to say, okay, now you propose to change to an architecture. Now, what is the impact on the testing strategy? Have you thought about process changes? Have you thought about your test architecture changes? Have you thought about what is the impact on the cross-functional requirements testing? All of those things needs to be recorded as part of architecture decision records or business decision records. So that is a very good process to begin with. And versioning of the architecture and the testing strategy is also might be required in some places, right? Like when there is a pivoting architecture, which is taking away something like a database to an event stream, which is like a huge pivoting step, which means the testing strategy for your architecture before could have been very different from the test architecture could have been very different. And so the versioning of architecture to the testing strategy might be required to keep a track of a long running project. Like if you're just part of an enterprise, it's going to be like a 10 years effort to keep a track of what happened, when it happened. and people might not be around to tell you the story as well. Dedicated roles like test architect or a head of QA to drive this kind of initiative, because it's like, if it is nobody's ownership, then it's everybody's ownership, and then nobody drives it. That's what is like the state of many of the critical parameters. So having some roles which has this ownership and looks at it with a keen eye and drives this across the different roles within the team will be really helpful. And including the testers on the team as part of solution design and business discussions, right? Like, not just treating as a team which is sitting outside of the development team, but it's like a well integrated cross functional team which is part of solution design and business discussions. And alongside all of those things, the testing strategy must also be discussed so that it becomes practice for the entire team to know that, okay, whatever kind of changes that I'm making also has an impact on the testing strategy. And once the strategy is, it is a possibility that there is no impact also, right? Like, but we should always have contingency for test strategy evolutions. That is something that, like, for example, some things could be out of our control, like how some tools that we are using on the project has moved on to a new release, and they have deprecated a new the features that I've been using in my testing tool, test architecture. So some kind of contingency to um, evolve the test strategy is uh, really important, but this kind of contingency is something that usually like kept for development purposes. But having that argument to include a certain capacity for testing evolutions as well will go a long way. And it does goes without saying, creating more awareness in the team about evolving the testing strategy itself is going to be really important. Um, Having the discussion about how testing strategy should parallelly evolve alongside all the business priorities changes and the architecture changes, having that awareness, thinking about how certain things affect the testing strategy itself is a starting point. So that was a quick session from me. I hope you do implement the evolutionary testing strategy. I hope you look back at how testing strategy needs to be evolved in your project as well.